Hi, I'm Sarah Shira, also known as Imagine Landscapes, and I want you to knit gnomes and I want you to enjoy doing it. This is going to be so much fun, and if you're watching this, I assume that you're very new to gnoming, and I'm really hoping to make this gnome schooling series of videos as helpful as you need it to be. Almost everything I talk about today, there are going to be further videos breaking it down more individually, so stay tuned and check out the playlist that's called Gnome Schooling. I did homeschool my kids, and from kindergarten right through to university, well, not through to university, but up till that point. So calling this gnome schooling is not only a pun, which I love, but it also kind of harkens back to my original purpose as a parent. Gnome knitting is very simple at its core. Of course, it can get more or less complex depending on the type of gnome pattern that you choose. So what do I recommend you have on hand? What are we going to talk about today? Well, first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about the skills you need to start gnome knitting, the materials you'll need to have on hand, and which patterns I recommend you start with. Now, if you can knit in the round, you can make a gnome. So if you can make a hat or a sock, you're already doing great. The main thing you need to be able to do knit in the round is to knit and purl and to do simple knitting decreases or increases. But the other thing is that for almost every one of those things, I've already got a tutorial. So aside from basic knitting and basic purling, I've shot tutorials for almost every stitch named in every one of my patterns. So there's lots and lots of help for you along the way. The two patterns that I recommend that you start with are Never Not Gnoming, which was the original pattern I published, or No Fun Like Gnome Fun. And there's going to be links and all that in the description below. So Never Not Gnoming comes in 3 sizes. This is the largest size. It is a simple, easy, fun pattern, and the reason it's called this is because I can't stop gnoming. I'm never not gnoming. My son made a joke one day. He'd walk in and be like, #mom's never not gnoming. What's great about Never Not Gnoming is it's simple. This is the largest one, so they also come smaller, and there are 2 beard options and some steps to help you along the way, and it's just a nice pattern. I love this one because it makes me want to modify it. I want to add a stripe here. I want to try, lengthening that there. So Never Not Gnoming's a great pattern to start with. Now, it does involve picking up stitches from the hat inside, and if that worries you, of course I've got videos about that. But if you want to skip that step for your first gnome, No Fun Like Gnome Fun was made to be a very simple gnome that also could be very small. So for context, this is the worsted weight gnome. So here's a fingering weight big gnome. So the fingering weight size of No Fun Like Gnome Fun is very small indeed. We're talking this big. So this one also comes with 3 pattern options, and the main difference between these two is that there are no picking up stitches. We transition right from the hat to the body. So if that sounds more appealing, this gnome was also designed to be knit sort of in an evening. If you're looking for a quick hit of success, this is a great pattern to start with. Of course, I've got lots of others, but if you're looking for help on where to start, that's where I'd go. Let's do a quick overview of the materials you're going to need. You're going to need yarn, needles, something to stuff the gnome with, and a couple of things to sew it up at the end. Let's break that down a little bit. There will be further videos that break this down even more if you need it. Let's start with yarn. Every one of my gnomes was written to work with fingering weight yarns, with the yardages and recommended needle sizes listed. A couple of them also have recommendations for DK weight or worsted weight, and I'm coming out with a couple patterns that use bigger weight yarns as well. Now you can knit a gnome in any yarn, but the yardage will change and the needles will change. Check the video on that. So if you're going to need yarn, I recommend that you use something with stretch and give, since we are going to be picking up stitches, since it's going to be something that if you're especially going to be doing a cable or something like that, I recommend that you stick to something stretchy, and for most people that means just stick with wool. If you go with cotton, in order to knit toys, we need to knit them fairly densely so that the stuffing doesn't show through and so that they kind of stand up a little bit even before we stuff them. Cotton can be very hard on some people's wrists. Acrylic works for other people, but if you're looking for a nice easy go-to, easy win, the average mini skein sold by dyers is going to work. And for most of my gnomes, in fact, right now, I think all of them, you need 20 grams or less per color, and most of them use 3 or 4 colors. So you'll need 3 usually colors of yarn in a yarn that you are comfortable working with. Then you're going to need needles. And this is the one place I get to disappoint people. There are a lot of needle options in the world. I've got the gamut here for knitting in the round. And the thing that disappoints people most is this one. So we'll start here, and then we'll get to the good news. This is a 9-inch circular needle that a lot of people use for knitting in the round, for socks or sleeves, and it does not work. At least not for the whole gnome. So if this is the only way you've ever knit in the round with a circular needle and you've never had to transition to magic loop or DPNs or some other technique like you would at the top of a hat where it gets really skinny or something like that, you're going to need to have another method for knitting in the round, because while this would work for the plumpest part of the gnome, it does not work when we get to the skinny parts. So 9-inch circ, not a great option. Might work for parts of the gnomes, but definitely not going to be the only thing you can use to knit in the round. Then we have DPNs, and I've got 3 here because I want to make a point. There are different material types, and I do want to point this out. Some metal needles are very slick, and that is not great, because since we will be knitting very few stitches in the round at points, when you have few stitches in the round, your balance point on the needle is slimmer, and so it can be very seesaw-like. Whereas if we have lots of stitches, that point is wider and it kind of braces and keeps it from being too wobbly. So if you have a wobbly thing because you have few stitches plus a slick needle, that can be really frustrating. So if you're frustrated, you might want to change your needle type in terms of the material. So what does that mean? Well, I really like carbons. Carbons are carbon fiber, and so right here they have the sort of the grip and the warmth of wood. They have the rigidness and the awesomeness of carbon fiber, and then they have the sharp, nice tips of metal, which I like for things like doing decreases or other stitches that have like where the sharp tip is a nice one. So that's carbons. But bamboo or wood needles are also great because they do have that grip. So do give a think to the kind of materials your needles are made of, and not just which technique you like best. Next up are long circulars. So short circulars don't work, but long circulars do, and there's 2 reasons, and one of those is magic loop, and I've got 2 needles here and they are just all tangled up. So magic loop knitting, you are using 1 long circular needle to knit, and there will be a video about that. So magic loop is great, or you can do 2 and do the 2 circulars method. So that's another option for your needles. And lastly, there are the crazy modern options. I really enjoy these. These ones are flexi flips from Addi. They work halfway between DPN and a magic loop, so they are another option. There are 2 main types of stuffing that we're going to be talking about today. There are fluffy stuffings and there are weighted stuffings, and most of my gnomes advise using both. If you were to be knitting this as a cuddle toy, then you're going to ignore the weighted stuffing pretty much, because fluffy is cuddly. The first option we're going to talk about is polyfill. Polyfill is a plastic product that is fluffy, comes apart easily, and is pretty much exactly what you think it is. It's just fluffy, easy to wash. The next option is roving. Roving is sort of very much like polyfill. It is natural wool from a sheep before it's spun into yarn. The perk of this is that it is not plastic and is biodegradable. You can get this from places where spinners get their yarn. It doesn't need to be dyed, it doesn't need to be fancy. The kind I got is sold by a mill and often used to stuff mattresses. So one thing, you will need way more fluffy stuffing than you think. This will not be enough to stuff this gnome. Fluffy stuffing is deceptive. At least if you want your gnome to stay fluffy for more than 2 days. So this is roving. And your last option may not be something you have enough of at the moment, but now that you know you can use it, you can enjoy it. And this is yarn ends. Yarn ends stuff in nicely. You can just kind of keep gathering them over the year as you clip things off. Yarn works well. Next up, we've got weighted stuffing. We don't need a lot of weighted stuffing, and there are a lot of options. I've got 4 here. They're not even I think they're maybe half of the options I've heard of. So the common thing you will see sold for toys next to the polyfill are poly pellets, and they are a little plastic pellet that are designed to be small enough that they aren't choking hazards. So that is an option for you. If you would like a non-plastic option, you actually have a huge number of options. Everything else pretty much is the non-plastic option. I live somewhere very dry and where we don't have a lot of pests because it gets so cold in winter. So for me, dried lentils or beans work really well. The bigger the bean, the more likely it is to be lumpy on the outside, so you might want to wrap it in a little bit of fluffy stuffing on the outside, or just be careful how big your bean is, but it's a great option for those of you who live sort of in pest-free environments. Another option is something like aquarium gravel. Aquarium gravel, this here is very, very small. I would buy it a little bigger if I was going to use it. You could use pea gravel from like a playground, although don't steal. Go to, you know, your hardware store or something like that. Some people use big washers. When using a big washer, one thing to note is obviously you need to be thinking about how big your gnome is at the bottom. This is a bigger washer than I would use. And the other thing to be thinking about is the fact that you need to put it in and then knit around what is a very rigid thing, and so the last few rounds of knitting can be a little awkward, but a washer can be a really great simple way, and your gnome will also always stand very straight. Other options I have heard of are, some people have cedar rings for hanging over hangers in closets, and a stack of those can also be sort of a nice flat surface and a weight for your gnome. Some people use the glass beads that are sort of like, they're like marbles that have been squashed. Some people just literally put a rock in. The one thing I want to say is that if this will be in the hands of a child, you have to be very thoughtful about what you're putting in there, because every young child that I've ever known has taken a toy like this and used it as a weapon at some point. It's kind of inevitable. So you don't want weapon grade material to be in the bottom of your gnome. Do think about whether you put a rock in if a child's going to get its hands on it. Lastly, we've got a few notions to talk about. So you're going to need some stitch markers. Depending on whether you're using DPNs or other needle methods, you will need more or fewer. DPNs act as their own sort of section things. So at the end of a section, you don't need to put a stitch marker. You get to the end of the needle. Whereas you might not need a fixed stitch marker, the ring markers. Whereas you might want more of the beginning of round type marker or the removable stitch marker. So removable stitch marker comes in two basic types. There are the safety pin style, the coilless safety pin that look a bit like light bulbs, also known as light bulb stitch markers. And then there are the types that have jewelry findings and they open and close accordingly. So those are two options for removable stitch markers. You will need scissors. Unless you're even if you're someone who likes to break your yarn instead of cutting it. Once the gnome is stuffed, we'll be doing a lot of cutting very close to the gnome so that the ends disappear back in, and so you'll want scissors. A measuring tape, because sometimes I say knit to X number of inches or centimeters, so a measuring tape might be on hand, although most things are also done by row count. A yarn needle, also known as a darning needle. I really like the ones that have a little bit of a tip at the end, specifically because when we are trying to sew on the beard or the arms, it's just a lot easier to use something that's already trying to come up out of the fabric. And that's what you need to know. You need fluffy stuffing, maybe some weighted stuffing, you need some notions, you'll need some yarn, you'll need a pattern, and you'll need to have fun. Don't stress about it. Wonkiness is gnominess. If your gnome doesn't quite follow the pattern or looks a little special, that's awesome, because it means you're making a gnome, and gnomes are so forgiving. They don't have to fit anybody. They only have to please you. So don't be apologetic, be experimental, be bold, and have a great time.